now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kristen, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for South Florida Wildlife Center. For those of you that aren't familiar, South Florida Wildlife Center is a wildlife hospital that's located in Fort Lauderdale, and we have a mission to rescue and rehabilitate sick and injured wildlife so we can release them back out into the wild, as well as educate the community about peaceful coexistence with our wild neighbors. So once a month, we host a wild lecture series. So we bring in speakers with lots of diverse backgrounds to come in and educate us about their topic of expertise. And today we're really excited to have Jen with us from FWC. She is a biologist with the North Atlantic Right Whale Program. So she is going to be talking to us about all things whales, what she does on a daily basis. And then, of course, there will be time for questions at the very end. While she's talking, if you guys think of questions and you're afraid you're going to forget, you're welcome to throw them down into the chat, and then we can come to them at the end of the presentation. So I am going to spotlight Jen and let her take over. Go ahead, you're good to go.
All right, great. Hi. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you guys about whales. Love to spread the love for right whales. Again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end. And I have a tendency to talk long, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into my presentation. Can you guys see that?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about right whale research and conservation here in the Southeast U.S. Our target animal, the North Atlantic right whale, scientific name Eubulina glacialis. In comparison to other large whale species, right whales are stocky animals, which partially due to their feeding strategy. They are large, roughly 50 feet in length and weigh over 70 tons. They're generally all black in color, but some individuals do have white on their chin and their belly. They have a very large head, again, because of their feeding strategy.
We lost your audio there for a second, Jen. I'm not sure if it's just me. Is everyone that's on, are you guys able to hear her? You can put it in the chat if you are. I'm going to mute you and then ask to unmute you and see if that helps. Go ahead and see if you can unmute and if your audio came back. No, now you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself?
All right, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear
you.
Okay. That was weird.
All right, then, take number 2. All right, can you see my screen?
Perfect, your presentation.
And you can hear me?
And I can hear you.
Okay, fabulous. Well, thank you again for inviting me to talk about right whales. We'll jump right in. Our target animal is the North Atlantic right whale, scientific name Eubulina glacialis. And in comparison to other large whale species like humpbacks or blue whales or gray whales, right whales in particular are very stocky, beefy animals. They're roughly 50 feet in length and can weigh over 70 tons. Generally all black in color, but there are some individuals that have white patches on their chin and their belly. They have a very large head due to the amount of baleen that they have, and their feeding strategy takes up almost a third of their whole body length. They have these roughened patches on the top of their head that's called callosity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And this very strongly arched lower lip that gives them an upside down frowny face kind of look. but you're unlikely to see that much of them from the water. From the water's perspective, for species identification, you can actually tell that what you're looking at is a right whale just by looking at the shape of their blow. Their blowholes are angled sort of away from one another, and when they exhale, it creates that very distinct V-shaped blow, so you can identify them even at a distance. They also have no dorsal fin on their back, which is different than most other large whales, and they tend to rest at the surface and do this behavior called logging, which makes them very flat and blend into their background. If they roll over and are active, you might see their flippers. They have broad paddle-shaped flippers. And their fluke is all black on both top and bottom with a smooth trailing edge. So that callosity is tissue that's part of their skin. It erupts out of their skin. It's sort of like a callus. That's sort of where their name comes from. And it's black, just like the rest of their skin. But what makes it look white is the cyamids that colonize it. And cyamids are also known as whale lice. They're small crustaceans whose whole purpose in life is to live on the callosity of right whales. They don't live anywhere else in the environment. They have no other purpose. They're specifically to right whales. And they feed on the dead sloughing skin cells and don't appear to harm the whales in any way. And there are actually several different species of cyamids that actually, their populations will shift over time. And certain types of cyamids are an indicator of poor health because they tend to proliferate when the whale is not doing well. So we can actually use those cyamids not just to identify the whales, but also to say something about their health. So right whales got their name because they were the right whale to hunt. They live very close to the coast. A lot of their favorite habitats are within 50 miles of shore, and they're very casual, slow-moving whales, so they were easy to get to, and whalers didn't have to go very far to reach them. They have incredibly thick blubber. It can be over a foot thick, and that makes them very buoyant after they've been killed, which makes processing them for their large amounts of oil a lot easier. And a lot of people don't realize that in addition to oil, whales were targeted because of their baleen, which was a precursor to plastic. And so it was used for all kinds of things like corsets and buggy whips and combs and brushes. So it was a very popular commodity, and right whales have very long baleen. So between the baleen and the amounts of oil that they yielded, they were the target species to go after for commercial purposes. Because of this, they were hunted nearly to extinction in all ocean basins, and right whales received international protection from commercial whaling in 1935, and federal protection in the U.S. under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the 1970s. And the last legally killed right whale in the U.S., this photo in the bottom right, was a calf that was with its mom in South Florida in 1935. And we actually have this photograph because a New York Times or Washington Post photographer happened to be on board a tuna fishing boat when they went out for the day, and they just came across whales and they opted to hunt them. And the photographer happened to be on board with his camera and so got photographs of the whales. And when researchers started getting more interested in studying right whales in the 70s and 80s, they built a catalog and they went looking for photographs of right whales, historical photographs of right whales, and they came across these photos from 1935. And they were actually able to match it to a whale that was still alive in the 80s when they started to build the catalog. And so she is one of the longest known living whales at the time, and she unfortunately was last seen with a wound to her head that was likely fatal, but she has not been seen since, and there was never a carcass discovered. But at the time, she would have been over 80 years old. And I just mentioned there are actually 3 different species of right whales. In the North Pacific, there's Eubelina japonica, the North Pacific right whale. They're separated into 2 separate stocks, the western stock and the eastern stock, but there's very little known about how much overlap those 2 stocks may have and whether they interbreed or intermix with one another. they're just very difficult to study. Unfortunately, their numbers are incredibly low. The western stock is estimated at roughly in the low hundreds, and the eastern stock that inhabits the area around the Gulf of Alaska is estimated at about 30 animals. So there's interest in learning more about the species and doing more to protect the species, but they're very difficult to study just based on the habitat. And so there's very little known about the North Pacific right whale. In the Southern Ocean, we have the southern right whale that is circumpolar, and that population as a whole is estimated to be about 12,000 to 15,000 animals. And they have distinct calving areas in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Argentina and South Africa. And right now is calving season in the Southern Hemisphere. So I just saw a post on Facebook that the South African group documented their highest number of mom-calf pairs that they have ever had during their study. So that's a really great news for the day. And then the focus of the rest of our presentation, we're talking about the North Atlantic right whale. And they used to range from the east coast of the US all the way over into Northern Europe and over to the coast of Africa. But the eastern population has been extirpated for a long, long time. There have not been any consistent sightings, just sporadic individuals that have been linked back to the population that is primarily documented off the east coast of the US and Canada. And our numbers for this population at the most recent population estimate were 340 plus or minus 7 in 2021, at the end of 2021. And we are about to have our annual consortium meeting in a couple of weeks here, and we will get a new population estimate from the most recent data, but we don't expect it to have changed very much. Just to get us a little bit geographically focused, right whale habitat ranges from Canada to Florida and everywhere in between. Cape Cod Bay and the Great South Channel out into the Gulf of Maine are their spring and summertime habitats. And then the whales expand out from there and go to places like the Bay of Fundy in Canada and the Scotian Shelf off of the southern tip of Nova Scotia. And in recent years, they've moved into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is a habitat that we were less familiar with. And we don't know how much the whales were using it, but they seem to have increased their presence there in recent years. And they have also started to show up in higher numbers in southern New England in places that they were not seen previously. So they're shifting around and they're changing their habitat in response to climate change that is changing where their food concentrates and is available for them to feed in the summertime. In the wintertime, the whales migrate along the east coast of the US down to their only known calving area, which is here in the Southeast US. And they're generally present in the Southeast from November to April, with peak sightings in January and February. And although this is the calving area, we actually see all different demographic groups here. So mom-calf pairs, but also juveniles, adult males, non-calving females, they all come here for varying different amounts of time over the course of the winter. Usually the mom-calf pairs are here for months at a time. The other demographic groups might just show up, spend a week or two, and then turn around and head back north. Because they are so concentrated close to shore along the east coast of the US, the right whales have been dubbed the urban whale, and they are exposed in higher percentages or proportions than the other right whale species to human activities, just by the nature of the habitat that they use. There are lots of commercial vessels and shipping lanes and commercial fishing and pollutants coming out of rivers. They're very close to shore, and they inhabit waters that humans inhabit as well. So unfortunately, the leading causes of death for right whales are entanglements in commercial fishing gear and vessel strikes. This is a really busy slide, but it's got a ton of information on it. As I mentioned, the population is currently estimated at fewer than 350 animals. When I started this work 20 years ago, we were right about this number. We had a slow, steady increase up until about 2010. We were slowly building the population, but unfortunately, it's been in decline since then, pretty steep decline. There have been 36 documented mortalities just since 2017, and the right whales are currently under what's termed an unusual mortality event due to an increase in documented deaths. And of the carcasses that have been able to be examined, again, like I said, vessel strikes and entanglements were the leading causes of death. Vessel strikes range from large vessels to small vessels and everything in between. It impacts adult whales. It can be sharp trauma, which is very visible on the outside, like these propeller strikes that are in these photos. But it can also be blunt force trauma that can only show up or can only be documented once you do a thorough necropsy. All three of these cases are Southeast U.S. whales. The whale on the far left is a 2-year-old that had 20 propeller cuts across the top of its head and across the top of its body. In the top right, we've got a newborn calf that got struck in the head. It's actually alive in these photographs and survived for about 2 weeks before it disappeared, but it was pretty catastrophic injury to the top of its head. And the bottom right-hand photo is about a month and a half old calf that was struck and killed just outside of St. Augustine. So how do these things happen? Whales are huge, right? Maybe you see this mom in the middle of this photo. She's 50 feet long. You're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, they tend to rest at the surface really calmly, not draw a lot of attention to themselves, and they have no dorsal fin that sticks up off of their back out of the water, which can make them difficult to see even in good conditions. But did you see the calf here as well? That animal is well over 2,000 pounds and 15 feet long, so that's not a small animal either. And even in decent conditions, they can be difficult to see. Just a few more examples of how difficult right whales can be to see, which makes them vulnerable to vessel strikes. There have been a number of management strategies attempting to address this issue over the years. For vessels, large ships, vessels greater than 300 gross tons, there's a mandatory ship reporting system where at several ports in the U.S., these vessels are required to report into a shore-based station, and in return, they receive relevant real-time right whale sighting information just to try to increase their situational awareness so that they can modify their behaviors if needed as they come into port. Here in the Southeast, we have recommended shipping lanes into Brunswick, Fernandina, and Jacksonville, which are our major ports that are in the calving habitat. And those were designed based on historical right whale sightings to try and minimize the overlap between where the whales tend to congregate and where the ships have to come in and out of port. And in 2008, a rule went into effect called the Seasonal Management Area Rule, Vessel Ship Speed Rule. And it says that vessels 65 feet in length or greater must travel at 10 knots or less within certain seasonal management areas. So it's essentially like a school zone where during the times of year when whales are expected to be present, vessels are asked to slow to minimize the chances of these types of interactions. So in the wintertime, this area along the coast of Georgia and Northeast Florida becomes that seasonal management area. And when the whales leave in the spring, then that ends and vessels are allowed to go back to their normal speeds. There's also a 500-yard minimum approach rule. We call it the 500-yard rule, which restricts approaches to right whales within 500 yards. That's 5 football fields. It's hard to explain to people just how far away that is, but it's a long way. And you cannot get close to right whales by any means. Vessels, aircraft, paddleboard, drone, that's becoming a problem these days. And if you do find yourself within the vicinity of a right whale, you're expected to depart the area at a slow, safe speed in a direction away from the whales. And the purpose of this 500-yard rule is to reduce the potential for these negative vessel interactions and injuries to whales, and overall just generally reduce the disturbance to the animals in order to help support population recovery. Here in the Southeast, it's particularly important because we've got moms with very young calves who are naive and curious about things in their environment. They don't have a lot of maneuverability. They're not going to get out of the way of boats. So it's best to try and separate them in space so that they have the space to go about their normal behaviors, bond, nurse, and rest. We've also increased our outreach to boaters in recent years, trying to explain even to boats, small recreational vessels, that what to look out for, how to increase their situational awareness when whales are around, safety concerns about vessel strikes. So obviously no one wants to run over and kill a whale, but also if you hit a whale at high speed with your boat, it can cause significant damage to the boat, and also is really a danger to the occupants as well. So it's a safety concern from both a human and a whale perspective. And we're also trying to just encourage people to understand the rules and the regulations, and also how to report sightings. Our research we can't be in all places at all times. So sightings of right whales throughout their habitats from the general public are incredibly important to us. Entanglement in commercial fishing gear is also a leading cause of death for right whales. And if vessel strikes are the quick way to die because of the catastrophic damage that they occur, entanglements are the slow and painful way to die. It can take an average of 6 months for the animals to succumb to injury, infection, and eventually to starve to death if they can't feed properly. So it's a long, slow death. And even entanglements that don't result in the death of whales have a negative impact on the population. Over 85% of the right whale population bears scars from entanglements. So this is something that occurs for them on a regular basis. Luckily, they're able to get out of it, and it's not fatal a lot of the times, but when it is, it can be a long, drawn-out process. And even if it doesn't kill the animal, it can have negative consequences for years because of the stress that it induces and the need for the animal to put its resources into recovering from those injuries, as opposed to doing things like getting pregnant and raising a calf. So there have been management strategies aimed at minimizing the entanglement issue. The Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team is a group of scientists, managers, and fishermen that all come together to try to find consensus changes to rules and regulations that would minimize the threat to whales from commercial fishing gear. And over the years, they have created this take reduction plan and then added modifications to try to improve its effectiveness. And it includes things like gear marking and weak links to help the whales break the gear. In 2009, there was a sinking ground line rule that went into effect, that these lines that connect traps at the bottom of the ocean that line has to sit down and lay on the bottom, as opposed to floating up into the water column where it can be a hazard. In 2014, 2015, they went about addressing the risk from vertical line. That's the line from the traps on the ocean floor to the buoy that's on the surface that tells the fisherman where his gear is. And they also, during that vertical line rule, they increased the number of traps that are required for every buoy that's at the surface. You have to have a significant number of traps at the bottom, and added a closure based on a high amount of co-occurrence between whales and gear. They have since added a few more modifications, including updating and adding another closure, and increasing or changing that trap per trawl requirements, and adding a weak rope requirement in certain areas where there's a breaking strength of rope that right whales have been proven to be able to break. So in certain areas that are fished, you have to use that weak rope. And they have significantly increased gear marking to fishery and to different areas, so that when whales are found entangled and rope is removed from them, we can hopefully trace that entanglement back to certain fisheries and areas, so that we can understand where the risk is coming from, so that we are making management rules that are less broad-brushed and more specific to where the problem is. And here in the Southeast, trap pot fishing for like lobster and snow crab is not all that common. We do have some blue crab fishing in the Atlantic Ocean, but it's a fairly small number of fishermen. However, there is generally gillnet fisheries going on in the Atlantic Ocean, and in the Southeast we have a seasonal closure. So when the whales are here, like that's ship speed rule, in the wintertime, gill netting is not allowed within a certain boundary that overlaps with right whale habitat. So other things that are coming down the pipeline but haven't quite reached broad use yet in fisheries is something that's called ropeless fishing or on-demand fishing, where instead of having a buoy at the surface at all, the buoy and the gear is held at the bottom and only comes to the surface for the fishermen to retrieve it when they are there to pick it up. So that removes that rope from the water column that is the risk to whales. This is up and coming technology. There's a lot of money and effort being invested in it, but there are a lot of technological and enforcement challenges that come along with it. So if you want to learn a little bit more about ropeless fishing, check out the Ropeless Consortium. So let's talk about the Southeast. That's where we're at right here in Florida. So what's so special about the Southeast U.S.? And it's these little guys. So the Southeast U.S. from Cape Fear, North Carolina to Melbourne Beach, Florida is designated as critical habitat for right whales, and it is the only known calving area for the North Atlantic right whale. So this is the only place that they come to give birth and nurse and raise their young. Females can give birth to one calf every 3 years. Gestation is approximately a year, and the calf is with mom for another year. And then she needs some time, a minimum of 1 year, to recover from that, replenish her fat stores, get healthy, and start the process all over again. On average, females give birth to their first calf at about age 9 or 10, although we've been seeing that age at first birth increase significantly. Some whales are 15, 20 years old and have not yet given birth to their first calf. And we're also seeing a lengthening of that interval between the whales. So even though they're physiologically capable of giving birth every 3 years, we're seeing calving intervals that are more like 6 or 9 or 10 years between calves, because they're not having as much success rebuilding their fat stores. They're not finding the food that they need. They're getting entangled, and that is draining their resources. So we're having significant impact on the frequency of calving in recent years, which is part of what is driving that population decline, not just mortality, but also a decrease in calving. Calves are 13 to 15 feet in length when they're born, but they gain about 100 pounds a day while they are here. So they go from being teeny tiny and just barely bigger than their mom's head to being almost half her length by the time they leave in the springtime. And the time that they spend here, there's no food for the whales here. The calves are nursing from their moms, but moms are feeding and lactating solely on their fat stores. They're taking their blubber and their fat stores and turning it into milk for their calf, all while they are not eating here in the Southeast. So when they leave in the springtime, they have really depleted themselves, and they need to get to the Northeast and to feed. So what do we do in terms of research and conservation here in the Southeast in the calving area? Well, it comes down to a number of different agencies and organizations all collaborating together for right whales. We've got 4 aerial survey teams that fly from North Carolina to Florida. There are vessel-based research activities, including photo identification, genetic sampling. UAS has become much more popular in the recent years, and acoustics. And there are volunteer-based organizations that do land-based surveys. There's a right whale sighting hotline, and volunteers that go out and respond to sighting reports. And we get opportunistic sightings reported to us from the Navy, the Coast Guard, dredge projects, and the public. So all of those sightings are really important and help us monitor the species. Our aerial survey objectives are to locate the right whales in order to document their distribution and habitat use in the calving area. We want to monitor the population, including reproduction and calving, mitigate vessel collision risk, and detect any injured, entangled, and dead whales. And we're going to talk about some of those things more in depth. Our surveys are flown every good weather day from November 15th to April 15th in the Carolinas and December 1st through March 31st in Florida and Georgia. And the survey area is from the Virginia-North Carolina border to Cape Canaveral and out to about 30 to 50 miles offshore. We use small fixed-wing aircraft and fly low and slow, 1,000 feet and 100 knots. And our track lines are spaced really close together, 3 or 4 nautical miles apart, so that we're not missing any whales. If there are whales within the area, we want to detect them. And this is just a little example from last season. With 4 planes, we flew 223 surveys, 64% of the available days based on the weather. And this is our survey effort from the Virginia-North Carolina border down to Cape Canaveral. You can see that the majority of the effort focuses on the area between Brunswick and St. Augustine. And that has traditionally been the core or peak of the calving area, as well as the highest number of vessel activities and commercial ports. So our surveys are funded by a collaborative effort between NOAA and the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Army Corps of Engineers in order to mitigate their impacts on the species. So it's particularly important to them as funding agencies that we cover the area that they're most frequently operating. So that's Brunswick, Fernandina, and Jacksonville. Here are our sightings from last season, 239 sightings, of which 142 of them were mom-calf pairs. That's not individual whales. That could be the same whales over and over and over again. And you can see that they span all the way from North Carolina to West Palm Beach. So our surveys only cover down to Cape Canaveral, and a lot of the sightings that occur close to shore from Daytona to Cocoa Beach and all the way down to West Palm, the vast majority of those sighting reports are generated by the public or by the Volunteer Sighting Network. So I mentioned that callosity earlier. It is actually a unique pattern for each and every whale, and so we can tell them apart just by taking their photographs. This is a really great non-invasive way to track the population. Using that unique callosity pattern plus scars and other natural features like their white bellies, we can just take their photographs over time in different habitats and monitor demographics, how many males versus females, young whales versus older whales in the population. In terms of mortality, when a whale dies and we do a necropsy, we can actually figure out which individual whale that was. We can monitor reproductive success. That's how I know that there are some whales that have not yet given birth, even though they're 15, 20 years old. Certain whales use different habitats more preferentially, and there are trends in health status and rates of scarring. That's how I know that 85% of right whales have been entangled, just strictly by taking their photographs. And when we use this data from a monitoring perspective, we can monitor population trends, develop recovery strategies, and evaluate management and conservation efforts. So last year, based on the photo ID of those sightings that we had, it was 47 unique individuals, including 11 mom-calf pairs. And as I said before, although this is known as the calving area, we do have a whole suite of different demographic groups: adult males, mom calves, adult females, yearlings, and they're here for varying periods of time throughout the winter time. Calving has been extremely variable over the years. The green line is to orient you to when dedicated aerial survey effort began in earnest in the Southeast. So everything to the left of it in the early years, we're less confident that we captured all of the calves that were born in those years because monitoring was a little bit more sporadic. But since 1993-94, we've been doing these surveys pretty consistently in the calving habitats. We feel much more confident that we have captured all of the calves that were born in a given year in everything from 1994 on. The orange lines are the 10-year average of the number of calves over the course of each decade. And you can see in the 80s and 90s, the average was just a little 10 to 12 calves born per year. We're feeling pretty good about the population in the 2000s. The average number of calves born popped up to like 22 each season, with a high of 39 calves born in 2009. And then since then, it's gotten a lot more variable, and we've dropped back down to 12, 13 as the average number of calves born each season, including in 2018, where there was not a single North Atlantic right whale calf documented that year. So earlier on, I mentioned the genetic sampling. That's part of our boat-based work. We have a genetic profile on a significant proportion of the right whales in the population. And so we're targeting getting genetics from the calves that are born each year while they're here and can be associated with their mothers. We know which half of the DNA belongs to mom. And we can actually assign paternity based on that if we sample the calf while it's still associated with its mom. We use a specially designed crossbow bolt to take a small skin sample. It's about the size of a pencil eraser. And we can get all kinds of information, including the sex of the animal, unique genetic profile, and paternity as well. Part of our survey goals is vessel strike mitigation. As I mentioned, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps, commercial shipping interests, harbor pilots, port authorities, dredge operations, law enforcement, they're all linked into our early warning system. And our surveys, when we come across whales, we disseminate right whale sightings directly to those professional mariners in near real time so that they can modify their activities, change their course, post another lookout, slow down, whatever it is that they need to do to reduce the likelihood of a vessel strike. And one of our goals is to detect entangled whales. If they're here, we want to find them so that we can try to disentangle them. And although we do not have a ton of fixed gear fisheries here in the Southeast, we do have a number of entangled whales here, generally at minimum one a season. Last year we had 3 entangled right whale cases in the Southeast. And the states of Florida and Georgia are part of the Atlantic Large Whale Disentanglement Network. So we have teams that are trained to assess, document, tag, and disentangle large whales. And FWC maintains a cache of equipment, and we are the primary first responders. We're basically on call all season long and ready to respond to disentangle whales at a moment's notice. It's extremely dangerous activity, so it's very important, even though people want to do whatever they can to help animals that are in distress. The best thing for an entangled whale is to report the sighting and stand by so that people who are trained and equipped with the proper equipment can come do the work as safely as possible. So what makes a disentanglement a success? We want really good photo documentation of the whale and the entanglement configuration because we want to figure out how the rope is wrapped around the whale, where it's attached, because despite popular opinion, they don't actually know that you're there to try to help them. So they get very evasive, and you may only have one chance to make one cut. So if you're going to do that, knowing how the entanglement is configured around the whale, you can target your one cut to the one place it might be the most effective. And so that's what you can see here. We're taking photographs and we're trying to figure out exactly how this whale is entangled so we can target our cuts to make the most impact. In order for a disentanglement to be a success, we want to remove potentially lethal gear from the whale. Again, despite what you might think, the best thing is not just to cut off whatever you can and hope for the best, because sometimes that can actually make the situation much worse. It becomes harder for professional disentanglers to help the whale if there is no trailing gear to work with, and it can leave gear attached in such a way that you haven't actually helped the animal at all because it's still got rope wrapped around its head and it can't open its mouth. It might not have anything trailing behind it, but you haven't actually resolved the situation. So we're very specific about where we try to cut and what we're targeting and what we're removing when we do disentanglement. And again, like I said, because it requires you to be in such close proximity to such huge, powerful animals, we want to keep injuries to the whale to an absolute minimum and have none to the disentanglement team. And in order for it to truly be a success, we want to get that gear, that rope, those traps, whatever it is, back, not just let it fall to the ocean floor and become garbage, but we want to be able to assess it and learn what types of gear whales are getting entangled in, where it's coming from, how and when it was set, as much as we can possibly learn about the type of gear that whales are entangled in, so that we can target our management strategies to be as effective as possible. And again, if there are whales that have died, we want to find them so that we can do thorough necropsies. If we find a whale during a dead whale during our aerial surveys, we'll get out there and get it towed to shore so that we can do a full workup and determine a cause of death if possible. A new tool that has come along in the last couple of years is called whalemap.org. And organizations that do whale research along the east coast of the US and Canada contribute data to WhaleMap. It includes effort data, sightings, and even acoustic detections of right whales. It's updated in near real time, usually within a day or two of the sightings. The information's up on the website. It is preliminary because we're trying to get it out to the world as quickly as possible. But it's an interactive map, so you can zoom in, you can choose different dates, and look at different areas. And there are management layers. You can see where the sightings occur in relation to the seasonal management area or different fishing areas. And it's just generally intended to be for situational awareness. So if you were in Virginia and you were getting ready to sail your boat or bring your yacht to South Florida for the winter time, you could go on WhaleMap and see all along your trip if there had been any whale sightings so that you can increase your vigilance, make sure you have a lookout, decrease your speed. It's all intended to try and minimize vessel strikes and increase situational awareness overall. And since since you guys are based in South Florida, I wanted to highlight a little bit of South Florida stuff. So despite the fact that the aerial survey area ends around Cape Canaveral and the critical habitat only goes down to about Melbourne, we do have right whales that don't know where the lines are on a map, and they do whatever they want to do. And usually every year we have one mom calf or two that go around Cape Canaveral and like to cruise real close to shore, down along the coastline. Some make it all the way down to Miami. Some turn around in Fort Lauderdale or West Palm. So nearshore habitat is very common for whales south of Cape Canaveral. They just come hang out really close to shore. We get lots more public sighting reports south of Cape Canaveral, but it's also, even though it's wintertime, the water is warmer, the weather is warmer and nicer, so there's just a lot more people out and about on the beach, surfing in the water. They're on spring break, and a lot more vessel activity and vessel traffic. And because it's not the main or primary right whale habitat, there's a lot less situational awareness about right whales in general. So when we have sightings south of Canaveral, there's a large collaborative response effort to try and verify that it is right whales, document and figure out who the whales are, and then monitor their proximity to various inlets and ports, and initiate law enforcement if we need to, get the word out via the Coast Guard and social media and other outreach channels, just to try to increase awareness so that we can protect the whales. Even if it's just one mom calf pair, they're just as important as all of the other mom calf pairs that might be hanging out off of St. Augustine and Fernandina and Jacksonville. So what can you do to protect right whales? Like I just said, nearshore waters of the Southeast are right whale habitat. So if you go to the beach in the wintertime, watch for whales. And if you see them, please report sightings. We want to know about them. We will go out of our way to track them down and gather as much information as we can. Sometimes we'll bring our boat down to South Florida and go out and try to get a biopsy sample from a mom calf pair that has evaded us thus far. We have had entangled whales or injured whales show up way down south, like Boca and Melbourne in the last couple of years, and we'll respond to those to try and document and disentangle. And follow us on social media. We create an album every year on Flickr, and we update our photographs really regularly, so you can see who's here, who's giving birth, how the calves are growing, some of the other species that we see when we're out on our surveys. We post pretty regularly on Facebook and Instagram. And as I've mentioned, we are not the only game in town. There are a whole bunch of different organizations that are working to learn and protect right whales. So please check out our collaborators and our other organizations. Look for right whales and report sightings. Again, if you're boating, slow down when you're in right whale habitat. Reduce your carbon footprint. We didn't talk too much about how climate change is affecting the movement of the primary food for right whales, but it has changed significantly since 2010, and that's part of the reason that we have had decreases in calving and increases in mortality. So anything you can do to reduce your carbon footprint that reduces the impact on whales and their food resource. Buy your goods locally so that we're not so dependent upon ships coming through the busy ports and crisscrossing the shipping lanes and the right whale migratory corridor. And consider your seafood choices, whether you want to support fisheries that may be having an outsized impact on the right whale population. And if you happen to be in North Florida in November, join us at the Right Whale Festival. It's in Fernandina Beach this year on November 4th and 5th. And you can learn more at rightwhalefestival.com. And that is all.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. So let's see. I learned so much about right whales. So I'm sure everyone else did too. That was really interesting. I also didn't know the thing that is sticking out at the front of my mind. I did not realize that all of that white that is on their face is actually from lice. I never knew that before. I took a picture of that when it was up on the screen because I never knew that.
Yep, people think that it's barnacles.
I thought it was barnacles.
Yeah. On other whale species, there are barnacles, but for right whales, it's actually the tissue that erupts out of the top of their head, and it gets colonized by the whale lice because that's the only place they can hang on. So they're like little mountain climbers, and they get like purchase on the little cracks and crevices, and that's the places they can hang on. The rest of the whale's way too smooth, so it makes that callosity stand out.
Very interesting. So I know that there are still quite a few of you connected with us today. So if you guys do have any questions that you want to ask Jen before we disconnect, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll give you guys a minute to kind of type any questions that you have. And I'm glad you were able to share the FWC research Instagram page, because that's actually how we found Jen, because one of her videos got shared and I saw it and I was like, wow, she would be a great speaker for our wild lecture series. So you guys, if you scroll back, you'll find her video, but you'll also learn a lot more about other research initiatives that are going on in the state of Florida, which is pretty cool. So I'll give you guys another couple minutes if you want to put any questions in the chat. While we're waiting for people to type in, I was recording this presentation. So if there is someone that you think would be interested in learning more about right whales, I will be uploading the recording on our YouTube channel. And if you guys missed part of the presentation, or you want to come back and refer to anything that she brought up, or any of those resources, or even that festival that's coming up in November, all of that will be on our YouTube. So you're welcome to watch that as many times as you wish. So I do see a question coming in from Isabella. It says, are there tagging efforts on these whales, or is tagging too difficult to do in terms of tracking purposes?
Yeah, so tagging is a hot topic. There's a lot that you can learn from tagging, but you have to have the ability to tag the animals. So for right whales, unlike dolphins and sharks that you see tagged, frequently, they don't have a dorsal fin, so they don't have that thing that sticks up out of the water that's made out of connective tissue. So it's difficult to tag them. So in order to put a satellite tag on them that's going to last for an extended period of time, that's going to allow you to collect a significant amount of data and track them and figure out where they go and learn something about it, you actually have to penetrate through the blubber layer into the muscle. And those are pretty invasive tags. And with a population that's so small and so sensitive to issues, there's hesitancy to do that unless we know that we can get a good return on that investment and that we're not going to do more harm than good. So there's interest in learning more and trying new and different things, but it's very slow process of trying those things in order to mitigate any damage or harm that we could cause. So a lot has come in recent years with suction cup tagging. So there are several different studies that use suction cups that can be for acoustics or dive behavior or video cameras like critter cam type things that you can learn a lot about their behavior, but those suction cups only last for at best 24, 48 hours. So you're not going to get travel type information from those tags. You can learn a lot about how they swim and how they use the water column. If you go back on, I'm not sure if it's on Instagram, but on our Facebook page, if you go back to last winter, there were 2 adult females that were tagged with suction cup tag off of the Virginia, North Carolina border, and it's got a video, and you can actually see the whale just like cruising at the surface, and she comes just barely above the surface, and she goes down just barely below the surface, and you can see just how that behavior makes them so susceptible to vessel strikes because they use just that very top part of the water column, but they're out of sight. And so you wouldn't even know that they're there for significant periods of time, but they're definitely within range of the bow or the prop of your vessel if you were to run through the area where they are. So even, shorter term tags can provide a lot of data, but the longer term tracking type data has not come online just yet.
There was also a follow-up to that. Is there a reason why these right whales stay so close to shore? Is there a particular reason they remain at the surface so often?
It's just part of their behavior and their life history. They've been using these areas for thousands of years. So just so happens that we've come along and decided to use their habitat, not the other way around. Their food resources in New England, Cape Cod Bay is like the hot spot of feeding in the springtime, and you can pack 200 whales in there in a very short period of time because that's where the food is the best. So it's really about, for them, the vast majority of their year is focused on food, eating, finding where the best spot to eat is. And in the North Atlantic on the East Coast, that those places happen to be close to shore in a lot of places that overlap with human activity.
Question. Thank you, Isabella. If I don't see any other questions coming through the chat, so I think we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you so much, Jen, for coming and educating us all about right whales, and for all of you that attended this presentation live or are watching our replay video. Again, I will, for those of you that are with me now, I will be posting this video into our YouTube channel. Make sure you check out the FWC research page so you can explore all the fun things that are happening in our state, as well as scroll back and make sure you watch Jen's video because that's what got me up too, and I wanted to learn more about the whales. But thank you so much. We will be hosting our wild lecture series next month, as with every month, with lots of fun, new, engaging speakers for us to learn more about wildlife and conservation efforts that are happening here in Florida, as well as throughout the U.S. and maybe abroad, depending on who we get to speak for us. And then if you guys aren't following South Florida Wildlife Center on social media, we do have Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, as well as our YouTube channel that we will be posting more videos on soon. So thank you guys so much for attending. Thank you again, Jen. I appreciate you being here with us, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.